So Garrett, thank you so much for being with us today. So you are a data analyst for ABC 15 here in Phoenix. Can you tell us a little bit though about how you came to this position?
So I've been a data analyst in elections and politics for about 10 years now. For the first part of that, it was in retail political campaigns. And then for the last few years, it was as an analyst for the Secretary of State's office doing elections and voter registration data. And I decided I wanted to, try something different. And interestingly enough, the news director at ABC 15 contacted me, and it was out of the blue. I wasn't actually planning on going into journalism, and we sat down and had coffee, and it sounded very intriguing and different, but not so different that it would be a world that I wouldn't be familiar with, because there's obviously some interrelationships, if you will, with politics and the media. So I decided to jump in on it. It sounded interesting. This was all pre-COVID, of course, and then once COVID came around, it's such a wealth of data that needs to be looked at and analyzed that it just sort of was the natural beat for me for the last year.
That's so interesting that you actually started before, presumably to just kind of be data in general and maybe more of a focus on politics.
Yeah, I was hired to do the political data and the elections data for the 2020 election, and the COVID-19 data was just that just sort of fell into our lap as it did with everybody.
Right.
So that became sort of the focus until the election, and then I shifted back to the election for about a month or so. And then once the election was over, well, the election lasted a little longer than it normally does. But once we sort of got through the December, January transition, I went back to COVID, more full time.
So I started following you when you worked at the Secretary of State's office, but I would assume that your Twitter following has grown maybe even exponentially since the COVID started, and you're certainly one of my go-to sources for COVID information. So I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about how you take all of this information that's coming from sometimes disparate and competing sources, and you make it accessible to the public. And then maybe you could add on to that, take it even a step further, and sort of how you make it accessible via Twitter, because that maybe there's two different strategies you have there.
So I think that's the key word, is accessibility. One of the things I've found about healthcare data is that it's actually quite a stretch in its normal form, if you will, its originating form, to be accessible to the public. There's a lot of data going around. There's a lot of statistics, much of it at a master's level understanding for some things, like, for example, the rate of reproduction, or what is commonly misconstrued as the R naught, is one of those numbers that we are all focusing on, and we had been focusing on for a long time, but it's actually quite a high level statistic for understanding. And so distilling this information into not only reporters that have to, because one of my main jobs is to be a resource for reporters. I do a lot on Twitter, but I'd say fundamentally, obviously my first job is to be that resource for the reporters, and they're doing their daily stories, their daily COVID stories, and anything there. I have to explain that to them first, and then taking that data and also further distilling it down to that 240 characters, so that it can be sort of widely disseminated on a platform, and also trying to keep as much speculation as to the data out of it as possible, because that's another thing that happens with health data, especially around this, is that people are expecting things to be moving at lightning speed, where health data doesn't move at lightning speed. In fact, most health departments are used to only putting out an annual report on these statistics. And so, having to be careful about interpreting the data as well, and not seeing, say, a short-term trend and saying, oh, this has a causal linkage to this, when we don't really know that. We're just assuming that. And it's just sort of it causes confusion out there, and it sort of politicizes the data. So I try to keep that politicization of the data away from it as much as possible.
Yeah.
Unless, of course, there is a clear trend. If there is a clear reason to interpret the data, then I will do so. But if it's not clear, I try to stay away from it.
Is that something that you have had sort of a trial and error as this has been going? I mean, I know this is
Yes.
basically new for everyone. I really appreciate the insight of like, we're used to one report a year and now we're basically reporting constantly. And so you're also in that boat. So
Yeah, there's definitely a trial and error. Especially early on, it really took a while to figure out, what trend lines to look at, what trend lines to ignore because of the way that the reporting works. We as a society, I guess this is my opinion, of course, but we tend to want to look at data as it's time stamped at the time of reporting. So for example, if today, I'm looking at the report right now, and today 939 cases were reported in Arizona on February 25th. Now, we sort of look at that and we think, oh, 925 people got sick, or excuse me, 939 people got sick today from COVID-19, and 121 people died today from COVID-19. And if you look at the data, that doesn't actually occur. It's actually within anywhere for cases, it's about a 4 to 5 day time frame, and for deaths, it could be a 14 to 20 day time frame in which that data is being added to the report. And so we tend to look at this and say, you have to be able to distill this and interpret it because it has caused some confusion, especially early on.
you mentioned fake information. So quickly, I just want to ask, has your strategy for sharing this information changed or been, or have you been impacted by some of the misinformation and it's such a hard word to say, misinformation and whatever. I'm going to try it. One more time.
Sure. Now, yes, absolutely.
Misinformation impacted
yes.
you.
Yes, especially back in the summertime. Yes, there was a lot of misinformation around COVID-19. Some of it was warranted, and some of it is just either manipulative or outright quote unquote fake news. So, and it's the strategy is sort of depending on which of these we're looking at. So, for example, one of the, I want to say misinformation, but not necessarily in a manipulative way or intentional way, was the positivity rate. And we were dealing with that for a long time, and I shifted my strategies based on that because a lot of times people were taking the cases per day that were reported and the tests per day reported, and then simply doing dividing those two and making a percentage and calling that the positivity rate. And what I learned early on is that because of the way that the tests are put on the epi curve and the way that the cases are put in the epi curve, that particular positivity rate could be off by 15 points of where it actually was. And this was a metric that people were sharing with good intentions, but it was still an incorrect metric, and it absolutely is still today. So I stopped using it very early on. And in fact, the people I worked with to get this information corrected, in many ways, they were, in some spaces, they would be considered sort of anti-establishment or anti-orthodox in the way that the COVID numbers were going at the time. They would have been, I wouldn't call them sort of, downplaying COVID, but they certainly weren't on the side of upplaying COVID. But it was worth listening to them because the way that these were very experienced data analysts, and the way that they were looking at the data, giving sort of a second look to this, I said, even though this doesn't technically fit the narrative that so many people are making about COVID-19, they have a point in the way that this data is being presented. And so I shifted to that positivity rate calculation pretty early on, and I'm glad I did. So that's an example of where, the misinformation wasn't intentional, but we were able to correct it. Some of the other stuff just simply has to be combat at every opportunity.
So my last question for you is, I have seen as an outside observer a lot more medical professionals, wading into Twitter. I spend a lot of time on Twitter, so I use that as an example, but it could be, any social media or other avenues, television interviews, to advocate for credible, good information and public health in a way that maybe they haven't before. And I'm curious to know, one, if you think that that's a good idea, and two, if you have any advice for people who aren't used to talking in this public way, for kind of, if they want to jump into this pool and join us, these public communicators, things they might consider.
I absolutely agree that it's very important for medical professionals and healthcare professionals to start disseminating more information publicly. Several of the contacts that I've made over the last year have been emergency room doctors, medical doctors, and nurses and other people that are really on the front lines of this. And, a lot of times with data analysis, it's always important to sort of use these informed anecdotes to verify some of this data. So, I mean, if we're showing hospitalizations are at peaks in 95, 98% usage in the ICU, if a medical doctor is saying, yes, our nurses are completely, overwhelmed right now. I'm going in for 15-hour shifts. It's completely insane out there. Then that is an important anecdote to add to the data and sort of affirms the data, especially when publicly, if a medical doctor says that, usually I see nurses and other medical doctors affirming everything they say. So anybody who interacts with that thread is going to see that, yes, obviously there is something to this. And then on the other side, I will have doctors that will, when things are calming down, they will say, things are getting a little better in there. And I think that's one of the things that people are missing about COVID, at least as someone who's been observing this for so long, is in many ways, the general public wants to see, obviously they want to see that their actions, whatever they're doing and whatever sacrifices they're making are making things better. And, that's one thing that we sort of miss, especially from the medical community is, we also want to know when things are getting better for you. Because we've already seen all the stories about when things are very panicked, and obviously these are very, very important stories to tell. But we also want to see when things are getting better. Now, obviously, we know that things are, it's going to take a long time for COVID-19 to be, sort of a footnote in what's going on at hospitals across the country. But still, everyone wants to sort of see that, that things are improving.